Hey everyone, my name is Brett Neese. I am the director of production for a local podcast network here called Podcast One. So we'll just dive right in. First off, very nervous. I'm typically the guy behind the mic, in front of the mic telling people how to speak, so forgive that if you sense any nerves. But one thing I do want to say about this type of group is networking is huge. Knowing people, who's going to look out for you, the knowledge they can teach you is incredible. And that's how I got into this role. My friend Matt Anderson here, we met down in San Diego. He was working a radio remote. I walked up to him and said, hey, I do a little audio engineering. He said, if you're that serious about it, come meet me next week. I'll tour you around iHeart San Diego. Sure enough, that's what opened the door. So I fully believe in these types of groups because they always work out as long as you're committed and you have a drive to learn. So big fan of this. So what we'll get into is Podcasting 101. Might be a lot of knowledge that many of you know, but I figure it's probably good to just see how we as a company approach things from the ground up when it comes to developing content, picking up content, anything like that. So if you do have any questions, we could save them for afterwards, but seriously, if I'm going through something and you just want to know more about it, raise your hand and I'll 100% get to you. So a little bit about me. Been over 12 years in the podcasting world. Helped a couple podcasts out in San Diego way back in 2012 when podcasting was, becoming a more popular thing. It was just a local comedian show, but that was where I got my foot in the door with podcasting. Helped production there, was a co-host there, and also the engineer running the audio and editing everything. I've spent over 5 years in radio, working with people like Ryan Seacrest. That's a picture of Ryan Seacrest. He's probably going to hate me for showing that, but and then over 2 years in sports television and radio. So down in San Diego, I was with Fox Sports San Diego. I worked with the San Diego Padres at Petco Park, running audio for them. And then also one of the big things that I loved doing was working for iHeartRadio in San Diego with San Diego State Sports. With Ted Leitner, he's kind of the Vin Scully, I would say, of the San Diego market. Great guy, but got to do San Diego State football and San Diego State basketball with him. And then, like I mentioned earlier, currently the director of production for Podcast One, right here in Beverly Hills. So about Podcast One. You may have heard of it before, but there are a ton of podcast companies out there. So what we do is we provide production, marketing, sales, and distribution for a lot of podcast shows on our network. We carry over 200 shows that release on our network and all other podcast platforms. Apple Podcast, Spotify, which is becoming a very heavy hitter in the podcast world, Google Podcast, pretty much any platform that you consume podcasts on. And then we cover various genres. We don't have one specific niche. So we have comedy, we have true crime, we have politics, lifestyle, and reality TV, amongst other categories too, some that don't fit the traditional genre. So some of our shows are including the Adam Carolla Show, The Prosecutors, which is a true crime podcast, You're Welcome with Michael Malice, it's a political show. The Lady Gang, my wife loves them, so had to put them on here. On Display with Melissa Gorga, that's one of the shows that I produce personally. It's a reality television show. She's a Real Housewife of New Jersey, so we cover the whole reality TV world. The Jordan Harbinger Show, it's a very intellectual, I'd say like coaching, mentoring type of podcast. I've Had It that we just picked up recently, these two very hilarious ladies that pretty much just do what grinds my gears weekly episode. The Inevitable, which is a fascinating podcast about the evolution of electric vehicles, hosted by two of our Motor Trend hosts. A little bit of a broker deal with that. Varnum Town, which is co-hosted by Kyle MacLachlan, one of the actors from Twin Peaks, the old Dune movie, probably seen him in a lot of stuff. He's in the new Fallout Amazon Prime series. Really great guy, one of the nicest people I've ever met. And then Off the Vine with Caitlin Bristow. She was a Bachelorette contestant, has been doing the reality TV world for a while, but more of just like a women's lifestyle type of podcast. So what is podcasting? Yes, I will be explaining this. A podcast is a program made available in digital format for download over the internet. Podcasts are similar to radio programs in form, but they exist as audio files that can be played at a listener's convenience, anytime, anywhere. First podcast actually dates back to 2000, where listeners downloaded news stories on their MP3 players, Rios, the iPod, things like that. So, ancient devices right now. And then if you're an Apple user, first time that podcast app popped up on your phone was in 2005, if you had an iPhone back then. So some industry stats about podcasting: over 464 million podcast listeners are around worldwide. And it's projected to reach over 504 million by the end of this year. The average listener spends 7 hours per week listening to their favorite podcast app. Various shows, but you can basically chop that down to an hour a day. And then podcast consumption is almost 50-50 across the demographic, men and women. Women tend to listen to podcasts a little bit more, but it's about, I think the real numbers were like 43 and 47%, something like that. Podcasting is an estimated $23 billion industry. I think a lot of the revenue from podcasting comes from the fact that it's not too expensive to get these shows off the ground, equipment-wise, and then just driving in sales. It's a pretty simple process. And then podcast show stats. I'm just going to break down a few of these podcast shows. About 4.3 million different podcasts have been released since podcasts have come out. So obviously it's a saturated market. However, only 700,000 of them are technically active by definition. So those are the ones that are still releasing episodes periodically. Some of the current top podcasts in the US right now are Smartless, Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes, and Will Arnett. That's a pretty entertaining podcast. Unfortunately, we don't have it. This past weekend with Theo Vaughn, he's a comedian, was a former Real World or Road Rules contestant, but he's got a good podcast, very funny. Call Her Daddy, which is a very, very popular podcast among the female demo right now. And then, obviously, the Joe Rogan Experience. Fun fact about the Joe Rogan Experience is they have nearly 3 times the amount of followers than the other top podcasts out there. So he has the last time I checked, about 14.5 million followers, which is insane. So why podcasting? I'm going to talk a little bit about why I got into it and just why our company exists the way that it does. The way we see the evolution of things, streaming and on-demand entertainment is obviously more popular than ever. And it's a continuing trend, or it's continuing to trend in the growing direction. So ask yourself, ask your friends, outside of event programming, live sports, local news stations, do you consume much live entertainment? Or do you search out entertainment and consume it when convenient? I think a majority of us have evolved to those consumers of media. That's why I think podcasts are great, because that's what it is. It's on-demand entertainment. If you want to hear a show, if you really like chicken wings in the various baseball stadiums across the U.S., somebody probably has a podcast about it. So you find what you want, you listen to it when you want. I think it's riding with that trend of on-demand entertainment. So this is typically the process of how we work with developing shows as a podcast network. Obviously, the first thing that we want to do is, how to start a podcast is the topic and the name. So what we typically talk to with hosts that come to us with projects, or just famous names that we think would be good for a podcast platform. We do this little, this is a helpful graphic. If it's you can see it. So basically, identify your topic. Choose something original. And that's the beauty about podcasting, is it can literally be anything. Like I mentioned, chicken wings in a stadium. If you've got a passion, you can put a podcast out about it. But when we talk to the hosts and kind of the developmental aspect of it is, these initial calls before we do any of these shows are, what are you an expert in? You might be known as an actor in, a lot of film, but what's your true hobby? What do you really like talking about? And that's where we can kind of start to develop a show that we think would be successful, because obviously you don't want to force a host into talking about something that they don't want to do. But it also helps to feed the content when it comes to it, because that's the easiest way to do it, is tell us what you're interested about. And then another big component of this, obviously for the success of any show, is who's your target audience? What type of listener are we trying to appeal to when it comes to this show? What gaps can we fill in the market? Obviously, I mentioned those stats before about the vast amount of podcasts that are out there. So what is this show going to fill in regards to that gap? And then what can make you stand out from other podcasts that might be doing the same thing or something very similar? Because like I mentioned before, a lot of podcasts are out there probably covering a lot of popular topics. So when we talk to a host, we ask them what's going to make this stand out? And that's where we start getting to develop, interesting original content for these creative shows. And then also a big component is it's pretty obvious to talk about, but I think a lot of people sometimes struggle with this, especially when we're talking with hosts, is choosing a name. Podcast name, it's very simple, but it should clearly align with the content, and it should be easily searchable. Sometimes we have shows that think it would be funny to misspell a name. Obviously, I showed one show that has "You're Welcome" spelled the wrong way, but for the most part, you want to make it very searchable, because like Jake mentioned earlier, the attention span for a lot of these consumers these days is instantaneous. If they're going to find it, or if they're going to search for it once, they don't find it, they give up and they move on to something else. So, and then we also talk about the format of a podcast. So with the host, we're asking them what's going to be your format. Obviously, some of these shows we listen to, they're a solo host, so they do the entire show. That's one format that we've seen work. It takes a lot of chops from a host to be able to run a 45 to 60 minute program on their own, but some are capable of doing it. The more popular ones that we tend to see are co-hosted shows. So we're two co-hosts or three co-hosts are riffing. They can bounce off each other, things like that. We tend to try to stay away from anything more than three, though, because obviously that's just a lot of voices and it can be chaotic, especially in an audio format. So the other type of format that we can do is interviews. A single host interviews guests every week. Those tend to be very, very popular, especially if you've got a host that has a very strong expertise and is just good with talking with people. Documentaries are another one too, in-depth discussions through interviews and research. Serial was a very popular documentary podcast a few years ago. The successful ones that we've seen in this vein have typically been true crime or something like that, retelling a story. And then reporting. Hosts that cover and analyze the facts of events and news. So these are typically weekly, whether it's the election coming up or following a team, a sports team, or a baseball podcast, anything like that. Those are typically more of the reporting ones. And then also storytelling and scripted narratives. We rarely see this on our end just because they take a lot of development to script, edit, things like that, and finding the right person to voice, these things. And it's more of a cast, more of an expense. So, but those do exist out there. What we try to tell the host, though, and the producers is just a consistent format does help create listener expectations, which are very important. And then we also tell the host, though, too, don't be afraid to try different formats. If something's not working, the beauty of podcasting is you can try it, and there's little cost to switch it up. So We have an approach with that with some of our shows that we want to retain, but maybe aren't performing as well as we think. We switch it, introduce them to we pair them up with a new co-host, or we change the format a little bit to try to see if that's going to have a positive impact on these shows that we maybe need to save. And then the release and structure is very important too. So what's the planned length of the show? Over 63% of podcasts are 15 to 45 minutes. So you don't see many shows that go beyond that. Obviously, Joe Rogan is an exception. I think some of his episodes are 3.5 hours long. But what we try to do as our network is really focus on listeners that are commuting, listeners that are working out at the gym, things like that. And also just, I think the attention span, for me personally, after 60 minutes is gone. Yeah?
Does that include advertising?
Yes, that does include advertising. So typically for our shows, I mean, a good length of a show for us, some of the shows that I produce is about 35 minutes. Then we pack about 15 minutes of ads, 3 breaks through those. More than that, a little bit, but 60 minutes might be like the cap of where we're trying to get advertising and content in there. Great question. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what we discussed with the podcast host is think about the intended listener and what their day looks like. Where do you assume that these people are going to be consuming it? If it's, a gym bro podcast, you can pretty much put your money on it that these guys are going to be listening to it in the gym. So how long is a typical workout? 45 minutes, something like that. That's where we'll start to really think about who we're delivering this content to. And then how frequent will episodes release? The more frequent, the shorter the podcast can be. Some of these news shows, go daily. And really these daily shows can be 10 minutes, if that. They're just giving you updates. Sometimes these shows don't have ads, maybe at the front or just on the front or on the back, but we've seen daily podcasts. Weekly or several times a week. This is obviously the most popular one. We tend to do once a week for a majority of our shows just because of the bandwidth that we have along with the production and editing. But weekly or several times a week is where most of the podcasts are. And then less frequently, there's another component, less frequently seasonal. These shows are, maybe rewatches of Survivor. Or, we're going to be the former contestants of Survivor, and we're going to just talk about Survivor when Survivor's on for 3 months. But after that, there's nothing really to talk about until the next season. So you do see these occasionally pop up sometimes. And then the big thing that we tell people, obviously, I think we all consume podcasts, is listeners' time is valuable. Just like radio, you got to keep your content succinct and tight. And a big thing that we have to teach hosts, I think, specifically in the podcast thing, especially because they're just interested in their content, is avoid rambling to fill time. Sometimes, you get to the mark while you're recording and it's repeating itself over and over and over again. So we try to stop hosts from doing that as much as possible. Another big thing to our production of podcasts might be pretty, repetitive knowledge, but recording episodes and establishing a cadence, that's very important for our staff and our hosts. So I'm just going to talk to how we kind of structure that. Establishing a production cadence is a key component to a successful podcast. Obviously, like I mentioned before, it helps create listener habits just like radio and solidifies expectations. So here's an example of a recording cadence for a podcast that would release every Thursday on our network. So Monday would be typically like a prep day. We have the producer prep what the episode's going to be with. They work with the host on that. Google Docs we typically use a lot just because we can all collaborate on one doc. It's very, very helpful. And then another portion of Monday would be to share any social clips of the previous episode. So last week's episode, continuing to re-engage the audience and make sure that they didn't miss anything from last week. Social clips obviously are huge right now. Videos even better when we can, even if we don't do a full video podcast, a vodcast, just having video elements for social clips is exponentially better than just doing strictly audio. Tuesday, we would record the podcast. That would be the producer and the host. Wednesday, the producer takes the show and edits it, and then we release it Thursday. So that's typically the cadence. And then along with the releasing on Thursday is also the social clip that we would share, or social clips, amongst the hosts, the guests, things like that. And then Friday, and if you have like a dedicated producer or talent, come up with the ideas for next week's episode. So this is typically the flow of how we create podcasts and make sure that we're not missing our mark. The other thing that I didn't put on this slide, but it's very important, and we try to get all of our staff to do it with the host, is having a few episodes in the can. You never know when something comes up and a host can't make it, a guest drops out last minute or anything like that. So having a few episodes, ideally before the podcast even launches, with evergreen content, nothing that's, not going to be relevant a week from now. Having those is a great insurance policy when it comes to things that more than likely will come up with staff or with talent. So how to start a podcast? The equipment that we use, the equipment that all of our podcasts use, obviously microphone, recording equipment, and a computer. It's that simple. The microphones we use are usually USB or XLR. The USB ones are great for any of our talent that are going to typically be doing all of their recordings remote, and they're not too tech savvy. They can literally just plug it in. They typically sound pretty good. And then our producers might do a little bit of a tech dialing in. But for the most part, a lot of our talent that's sitting on a laptop don't want to stress about the equipment or anything. We just send them USB microphones and they work. And then we have XLRs too, which we all probably know are great for multiple guests, a proper mixer, doing all the EQ and things like that. Those are, if our talent's gonna intend to build a studio or, have these types of things, that's where we typically go the XLR route. The recording equipment too, local recording devices are great. We've probably all used them, but, Zoom, H-Series, those handheld ones are fantastic. Roadcasters, anything that's a little bit tinier that could potentially travel is fantastic. And then also just USB codec recording devices. So those go directly into a computer. The H-Series has its own built-in USB codec. I have a Mackie Pro FX mixer that has a USB in it. And then I'm sure we've all seen the red boxes, the Scarlett Focusrites. Sorry, Scarlett Focusrite. Focusrite Scarletts. Always forget that. Always forget that. And then computer. These are probably the most simple needs to make sure are happening. It's just something that's going to take an audio. You just want to make sure that it's convenient to use and it's not frustrating. Yeah?
Do you incorporate cameras during your podcast on any of them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, actually. So next thing was cameras. Yeah. So if we're typically doing that now for all of our podcasts, just to have, if they're not, as I mentioned, not doing a full video episode that's going to release on YouTube or anything like that, we still use a camera for social clips, which is great. So those aren't typically high def just because for a lot of our podcast hosts, they're stretched across the US. We can't send a producer out to help them with tech. So what we usually do is just send them USB cameras. And then for our professional studio in Beverly Hills, or anytime we're having a host go somewhere in their town, we typically rent out a studio that has professional cameras, Sony's, Nikon's, things like that. But the additional equipment, not absolutely necessary, but definitely helps out with the quality of the product, is mic stands. They're convenient, and for us, it helps keep our talent just focused and directionally aware of where to talk into the mic. And then pop filters. They work really well and help reducing the percussion in any voice. And then lighting too. For these videos, we typically have them use a selfie ring light, or for our studio, any studios we're using, we typically ask if they've got panel lighting or anything good like that. And then soundproofing. Soundproofing is somewhat difficult for a lot of our hosts that are traveling, but if we know they're going to be stationary, we'll send out something that we can pre-build and then just ship off to them, have them hang it up, anywhere in their room. But that or soundproofing too if we can't have a physical, anything sent to them, we'll assess where they're going to be. There's a podcast that I'm working with right now with the former campaign manager of Donald Trump, Kellyanne Conway, along with David Plouffe, Obama's campaign manager. We know they're going to be traveling a lot. So one of my first things that I'm going to be talking to them about every time I know that they're not at home is just, what room are you going to be in? Let's figure this out. Let's spend 15 or 20 minutes just to find the best spot in those rooms, or find a closet. And then this is what we send to our talent. This will give you a good idea of just how little of a lift it is to get a podcast off the ground. We just send microphones, like I said, typically USB microphones, Shure or Audio Technicas. We have some Shure SM7Bs in our studio. Obviously, they take a little bit more with preamping, cloud lifting, and things like that. But for the most part, we just send USB microphones to anybody that we know is going to be remote. Pop filter, as I mentioned, lighting, we'll send a selfie ring light. Something typically that has temperature and brightness adjustment, just because we don't know where they're going to be. And that's a very convenient thing to have, just to make sure they don't look too creepy in a dark room. And then USB cameras. What we typically send right now are Logitech Brios. They record in 4K, which are great because then we can crop down for social clips or anything like that without, with retaining the quality that we're going to put out on 1080 platforms or anything like that. None of our shows yet have hit the 4K mark in regards to YouTube or things like that. And then the total cost for all of this is about $350 per host. That can even get trimmed down a little bit too for some people, but that shows you just how little it costs to really get audio captured and video captured for somebody that wants to start a new podcast. And then recording remotely. One of the key benefits, I think, of COVID, sounds weird to even say it that way, but many times guests can't make it in person, so luckily there's many web-based recording programs out there. Zoom's shown us that, but we typically will use StreamYard, which is a good web-based recording program. Riverside FM, I'm sure many people have heard about. That's another web-based conferencing recording software. And then Zoom and Teams too, but Zoom and Teams we try to stay away from just because there's a lot of compression going on in the audio degrades, and video quality is lower too. So I think in order to get 1080 from Zoom, you have to actually call them and get it set up, which is just too much of a hassle for us. So StreamYard and Riverside are what we primarily use. And then the big thing when looking for this type of software, for anybody that we tell in our network or outside of our network that's looking to do remote recording, is it's important to find software that can capture isolated audio and isolated video. When it comes to putting everything together at the end, it's just so much more convenient and easier to clean things up by doing that. So that's what we tell anybody that we're going to keep on our network, that won't ever be on our network, but just isolated audio and video is huge. And then editing software and publishing, as Jake said, I keep mentioning you, but the convenience of things nowadays, where it was 15 years ago, is incredible, and it's just a computer now. You can capture everything on a computer. The software that we have for editing audio is typically Adobe Audition. Final Cut Pro is another one. Pro Tools will sometimes use, but I think the learning curve of that is sometimes time we just don't have. So Audition, Final Cut Pro are good. Those are paid. Mac owners, GarageBand too, if we're just trying to capture audio or do a quick edit on that sometimes works too. And then free, Audacity. Audacity is fantastic for us for loading it onto a computer with a talent that we just need to capture audio from too, along with conferencing, just as a backup. But it's fantastic. Video software, there aren't many good video programs out there that are free without charging something. So that's where we typically spend the buck and either use Premiere, Avid Media Composer, those types of programs. And then AI software. That's the new thing. But it's not as good as human. You always need that. So we sometimes use a program like Opus Pro. That's great. You can drop all of the video into it. It'll do an AI algorithm and spit out social clips, which is pretty convenient for us. Obviously, we still have to then take those clips, run them through Premiere Pro or something like that to put the graphic overlays on for the podcast show, or cleaning up things that the AI just didn't catch. But Opus Pro is a fantastic one. There was a software too that I was gonna write, but I couldn't find it. I couldn't contact our friend that uses it at our company, but there's another program too out there that will take multiple isolated videos and audio, sync them all up, and switch to do one-shots of the host as they're talking. So it reads the vocals and knows when to switch between those shots, which is very convenient, cutting down time. But the caveat to that too is you need a human there to check it out, QA it, make sure it's all good. And then publishing a podcast. The last component of this, once everything's wrapped up, in the can, ready to roll, you have to attach the show to an RSS feed. That's what gets these shows distributed across all the platforms. There's options for RSS feeds. You can find a network to host your podcast. You can subscribe to a hosting site that creates these RSS feeds for you. The good thing about that with these hosting sites is the data, the analytics, viewer demographics, things like that are all easier to kind of look at and assess through these subscription sites. Those are Podbean, Buzzsprout, RSS.com, or you find a tech buddy to create one. Fortunately, I don't know how to, so sorry about that. And then the last thing I'd say is once everything's out, or even before it's out, what we tell our hosts too, or anybody that's doing a podcast, is get the word out. Grassroots promotion is sometimes the best, so create a social media presence for the podcast. That's where you can share social clips, teasers leading up to the show. What we typically do is we'll create a show Instagram account, have everything running through there. Instagram seems to be the best social media site out there for promoting podcasts right now. TikTok, we haven't really found much success with that yet. I think until podcast consumers move over to TikTok a little bit more and start looking for that there. But yeah, Instagram seems to be the best. And what we tell our hosts too, or anybody associated with the podcast, is engage with the audience. Whoever's running that social media account, you put out a clip, people start asking about it, or want to engage more, do it. That's how we create habitual listeners that feel like they're sitting in the studio with these hosts and they have a true relationship with them. And then we tell them too, tell your friends. This works really well. Oh yeah.
Do you guys cross-promote them with other programs on your platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do a lot of in-network promotion where we'll have hosts go on other shows just to kind of expose them more to either a demo that we know will work really well, or just sometimes to just see if there's anything that would carry over. We also do that. Oh, sorry.
What about the radio stations too? Because some of the people that are on radio are doing podcasting, so I would think there's some cross-promotion there as well.
Yeah, I think so. For us specifically, like we've pulled on a few talents from, I think Alt. He was with Perez Hilton. I can't remember. Booker. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Booker was on a podcast. I think he would tend to, promote the show. Hey, you can catch me more here, things like that. So we don't really stay away from it because we just think it's going to work in our interest to have them promote. So we're not we don't handcuff our talent too much to not promote elsewhere. Marketing is key. Yeah. Yep. And that's how we survive. Yeah, that's how we survive as a podcast company, is just exposing ourselves out there, seeing what we can bring back to our show.
The reason I ask is because Norm Caditz is the guy who started Podcast One,
Yes.
right? And he was a gigantic radio guy.
Yep.
So that's, to think that he would be kind of, that would be something that you guys would be doing.
Yeah. Norm was instrumental in the building up of Podcast One, making sure everything ran right. I think brought a level of professionalism to this industry that I don't want to knock it beforehand, but it was just, he knew how to drive traffic, do sales, marketing, the proper approach from a radio perspective, which I think was something we absolutely needed to get off the ground and running successfully. But yeah, I think, when it comes to in-network promotions too, we also do every episode across our shows is promoting a show in one ad spot of, promoting a show within our network through an ad spot. So we have a meeting every week to discuss, okay, what do you think this promo would work well with? Then we slot those in, drop them into every show, but we're always doing that. And then back, oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
What percentage of podcasts do you either shoot video and then distribute video as well as just audio only?
Gosh, that's a great question. For our particular programs, or like our network, I would say maybe a third of it. Yeah, don't hold me to that number, but I think we're starting to grow more with that. Starting to see that that's how everybody wants to see it now. So more podcasts that we're doing will have more video components to it, or just full episodes, but I'd say maybe about a third now. The only cost associated with that, obviously it costs more. So that's where we're trying to.
It's currently a third, but it's a growing industry for podcasts to be audio and video.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. And there's just an appeal to it. Vodcasting is growing more than ever, and I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. Especially as YouTube becomes, a more popular, it's always been popular, but I just see all of our podcasts that go onto YouTube, just the numbers almost outweigh the audio portions of our, every time. So, but yeah, last thing I would say is when it comes to hosts and everything too, is just we tell them to tell their friends. That's a cool way that we market these shows out too, because a lot of the hosts that we acquire already have dedicated fan bases and things like that. So we tell them, hey, tell your friends, tell all your listeners, follow this, and it's always worked really well for that. And then the last thing, sorry, I always say last thing, there's one more thing, but we invite guests on to these shows that we know can cross-promote these shows too. So whether it's somebody that has a huge following on Instagram or anything like that, that's sometimes where we tell people, hey, invite guests. We also tell that to shows that we aren't going to pick up, but just like pick up guests. There's no harm in grabbing a guest that can help promote the show more. So sounds very simple, but sometimes people just don't do it. So that's pretty much the end of the slideshow. Covered a lot, but any questions?
On the delivery end, I've noticed a lot of podcasts,
people who deliver only allow streaming. You can't download it and put it on a flash drive and put it in your car.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know why that is, outside of potentially the loss of analytics, maybe, that we wouldn't have if it.
Well, if you download it,
Licensing.
that would be a listen to.
Yeah, correct. And I don't know.
There's a few I download, put in the car, and when regular radio is not available to me for one reason or another, usually a sports event, I'll usually turn on a podcast I've downloaded. It's in my car waiting for me.
Yeah. And that's fantastic too. My wife and I do that all the time when it comes to road trips and we don't know if we're going to get service for streaming or anything like that. But yeah, I don't know the thought process of not making it downloadable outside of potentially just a loss of some form of analytics.
Downloadable, so you can.
Yeah. All of our podcasts are downloadable. It might be a platform thing too. I don't know if, like, if you went to, I couldn't tell you which one, but I wonder if it might be something with the platform itself. If Spotify doesn't, as an example, Spotify wouldn't let you download it, but Apple Podcasts would. I don't know if that might be a.
I'm not an Apple person, so.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't really know why that would be. Sorry.
I'm curious why On the Media doesn't let you download it until after a week after the show goes.
Kurt Carnack was like one of the first podcasters.
I'm sorry.
Kurt Carnack. Don't you guys think, Kurt?
Yeah.
He was like doing it for a long time. One of the engineer guys that worked for.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Poor man. What do you have, are there any podcasts that contain music? And because probably there's licensing issues, so I guess all of them are strictly talk, correct? Are any of them music in your facility?
We don't have like popular music or anything playing. Obviously, we have we use a library where intro music, things like that, we'll use. We tend to not put music in any ads, but when it comes to pop or anything that you would hear on the radio, I think podcasts typically stay away from that just for licensing and to avoid getting in trouble.
So you just use a production library then, just for bumper music, stuff like that?
Exactly, yeah.
Nothing that would be BMI or ASCAP, compliant?
Yeah, exactly, like royalty free. Occasionally, sometimes the YouTube algorithm will go wonky and will flag us for something that we own. So we have to clear that up with our Megatracks as our royalty free music library. So, but yeah, nothing where Justin Bieber would be playing on our podcast or anything like that. Yeah.
Who would want to listen to that? Let's go back and explore Maria's question about advertising, because I'm not a podcast listener. So I don't understand the mechanics of how advertising gets mixed into it, both physically when you produce it and then for a listener.
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously advertising and sales are why we exist, I'd say, and why our company functions. So it's a huge portion of it. What we'll do is we'll have, for us, I'd say most of the time with our podcast, the podcast will take a break, roll 2 ads, and then return to the podcast, however long. But with those ads that we have baked in, the host typically reads them, the producer works with the host to record them, and then drop them into the podcast. And then the more you can kind of sense an ad campaign, or how we typically have most of our ad campaigns is, somebody will say, hey, we've got this new Lumen product. Go to lumen.com, they'll do the spiel about it, and they'll say, go to lumen.com/malice, one of our host last names, and use that and you'll get 25% off. So those are typically the ad campaigns that we do use for the most part.
So those are internal to the whole recording?
Correct. Yeah, correct. We do have programmatic markers that we do drop in through our library of current programmatic ads that we need to use at the time, and those just automatically drop in through our CMS tool. But on the initial delivery into the CMS, what gets the content out, those ads are baked into the true audio file. It's just one file.
Right, and then whoever you're listening to it from is going to add their own, like YouTube. When I watch Marcos's stuff, it just interrupts whatever I'm watching.
Yeah, and that's difficult too sometimes because we can't figure out why when YouTube launches their own ads. So we delicately do that with video, just to avoid an ad running baked into our video that would then toss to a YouTube ad 5 minutes later.
So going back to the show itself, when you have an advertiser, it's all spoken word by the host versus a canned spot that you're going to play?
Yeah, for the most part.
Like in radio, we play our spots.
Yeah. Those, for podcasting specifically, it's typically the host that does it, I'd say 95% of the time. And the big way that I'd say, entice the ad agency or the company to promote their product on our show is the personal endorsement factor. That's huge for us. Obviously that resonates the most with our customers. And our ads are typically 60 to 90 seconds long for each product, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. So in radio, in syndicated radio, they will, your salespeople will go out and they will, as at a network, they'll take a bunch of shows, I call it making the pie. So everything's formatically, they go out and sell a format, and they take all the aggregated audience, and they go to an ad agency, and that's how they get their advertising. So they have all the, it's the same demo, it's basically, the same format, not necessarily the same format, but close, like all the country shows, they'll go do that, and then they sell it. You guys don't do that?
We do in a certain extent, but I would say we have a pretty small sales team. Correct me or stop me if I'm not answering the question right. But for us, the way that we'll do it is we'll vet the product or any potential product through the host, ensure that the host is on board with it. I think that's the luxury of not having too large of a network. Is we'll directly contact the host and say, hey, this looks like something that a lot of people might be, or a lot of campaigns have used, or this is a product that seems to have a lot of campaigns out there right now. Is this something that you would be interested in?
So do they, so another question with that then. So you're not really selling it. Can they sell it themselves? Can a network come in? So let's say Westwood One, Mike Carruthers is one of them, something you should know.
Yeah.
He does a big show, and he was huge in the radio. I mean, he made, he was syndicated everywhere. He actually started a podcast. He's been very successful with it. But I know that Westwood One sells some of the spots in his show. So, I'm curious, do you allow that to happen where they can bring in their own advertising from outside and do it that way?
Yeah, 100%. And that's where the cut of revenue changes, the percentage of revenue changes. If they've done the legwork to bring in the ad, my gut is telling me that he's probably getting more of a cut of that, or if not the full cut, where if our sales team goes out, acquires the campaign, we're the ones that bring it in and do all of that vetting or whatever. That's where we tend to take a larger percentage of the revenue.
Right. He's going to go, he actually takes, he's using the same ads and the same advertisers that the radio stations are using, basically, is what he's doing.
Yeah.
Some of the spoken word, if he has to do the voice, actually go and do the voiceover work for the state, do live record or a live read, then, then he would do that. But most of it, I know, is sold by them.
Yeah.
So, and do you guys work with some of the networks like that? I mean, I know At Large does that.
Yeah.
With Cadence, I think, was what they were working with. And they actually are supporting podcasting and selling it on a national level. So that's why I asked.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about that. I think that's a little bit out of my realm, or what I'm have the vision on. But I imagine something like that happens in our network. But what I'm typically aware of as a producer and overseeing producers is the vetted campaigns that have worked through talent, been approved by talent. Then, we get on a call with either the company itself or the ad agency that's running this. And then we just make sure that everything aligns when it comes to how we're going to deliver this ad. And
how much, when do they actually start making money?
Podcasts?
Yeah.
I'd say there's varying degrees of it, but I would say if a show that we have does not have a minimum guarantee, if it's strictly just revenue that we're creating off of ads that we've probably already sold for the show or we know work across our network, The amount of money that comes in is typically pretty quick, just because the staff isn't. We have a minimal staff, I think, for a good reason. But we're not expensing too much when it comes to a producer or, as you've seen, equipment. And then it's just weekly, expensing what it costs for our employee, along with editing time.
So you're break even on the production, and then they have to have a certain amount of listeners.
Yeah. So the way that we sell ads is there's certain tiers. Typically, like once a podcast hits about 10,000, that's where we can go externally and find interested buyers. Anything under that is typically might be more of what a host finds, because they're like, hey, I've got a connection with this person. They don't care about the numbers. They just know I'm good at selling this type of product. So, and then 25,000 is another threshold that we try to achieve with weekly listeners. Obviously, we factor that into with impressions on social media. So that can be another influencing component to, things like that. So, and then we have tiers above that, but I'd say 10,000 is usually the minimum mark of, okay, we can sell this show, we can make money off of it without having to rely on the talent finding their own, connections.
I had a question. So I am a podcast listener.
Nice.
And I had a question. So if you watch something on like YouTube, for example, I've seen it where the podcast will play the whole thing. The ads will be from the actual host, but then you download it from an actual Apple, and they'll have baked-in ads that are like cut inside because you're downloading the file.
Yeah.
My question is the analytics of that, and do you guys use anything to kind of like track that depending on the different platforms that you download from, and how much does that influence your decision making in that process?
Yeah, I would say, the analytics don't get too far lost if we're specifically using like a promo code or things like that. Those are easy to retain. When it comes to what we're not too exposed to what programmatic is going to make on the Apple end. If Apple or Spotify tends to drop something before an episode, I think Spotify does that very frequently. Is you'll queue up an episode and they've got their ad running first. But we in our network, if you do download or stream off of Podcast One, our network, we have programmatic at the front too. So those are easier to capture. I think it varies on what platform we're trying to pull these analytics from, but the direct sales that have promo codes tied to them are very easy to track. And listener demographics, things like that, consumption rates, all of that, we tend to get very easily. So is that?
Do you use that like as a tool for?
100%. Yeah, consumption rate is something we use a lot, especially when it comes to trimming down episodes, like format structure wise, of just, hey, we're having a big dip in listeners after 37 minutes. That means that we have to trim this thing down. Obviously, the content's just becoming not consumable, boring, whatever it could be. But we look at those consumption rate numbers as, okay, also in regards to timing for ads, increasing revenue off of that, you want to make sure that you're not launching ads at the 40-minute mark when people are significantly dropping off after 38 minutes. Yeah. Great question.
I have one more question, and
Yeah.
then I'll be stopped. Are you working with Xperi?
Not to my knowledge.
Because they're creating the whole in-dash infotainment, experience, and I'm just wondering if you guys are working with them, because I know they're really, they're working on attribution, which is kind of what he was talking about. It's the attribution with the spots. Are they going all the way to the end, making the purchase? I just wondered if you guys are going to be working with them at all.
I don't see anything. I haven't heard of anything planned like on the horizon, but I do know that our parent company, Live One, it's ran by Rob Ellen. He's been in the industry for quite some time, but he brokered a deal, don't hold me to it, but it might have been Tesla or Ford or something, where in-dash entertainment for any Ford vehicle that was sold for a few years had a pre-programmed app in there. So yeah, great question, but nothing for Podcast One as of yet.
How much do you know about where people listen, when they listen, and who listens?
So we get a lot of information on regions. So we know where our biggest cities are across the U.S. and who's liking that. We tend to get Europe numbers and Canada numbers, but I'd say specifically for the United States, we know exactly where listeners are listening to these shows. And then timing-wise, that's a little harder to determine. We know like days that are successful, but when it comes to like specific hours in the days, we don't know really when a majority of our listeners, whether it's 5 o'clock on, in a time zone or whatever, but we do know.
Cell phones in the bathroom versus in the car, in the kitchen. They listen off of devices, or is it?
Yeah, we do get device analytics, so whether people are consuming this on Android or iPhones, YouTube, things like that, or also platforms. So Spotify, where our biggest audience is, whether it's Apple Podcasts, or I'd say, what do you call it, Mac iOS or whatever, that's what we see, or Android users, things like that, but yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure I didn't mean to. I like podcasts, but the issue I have is I don't have a good place to listen to them. I'm one of these people who I like real speakers and be able to wander from room to room. So I'm either listening on this little tinny piece of crap cell phone, or I'm trying to Bluetooth it to something that I can spread around, and it's just so freaking clumsy compared to turn on the radio and listen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the one benefit that we have is because we know that these typical users are on their phone, we don't have to invest too much in audio quality outside of just something that's going to sound good, whether it's shouting out at you or with headphones plugged in. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments, inquiries, complaints?
All the complaints.
That was really.
So that was really good.
Yeah.